Hey everybody, Brandon here. Welcome back to another episode of the Road to Chess Mastery. Today we will be covering game number 4 in my 10th tournament. And let's just say this is an interesting one. I mean, yeah. Okay, let's jump into it. E4, C5, knight to C3, and D6. Even against F4 stuff, I will usually play G6, and this is exactly what happened. So I'm playing against the Grand Prix, just G6, Bishop G7, develop normally kind of like a dragon setup. But after G6, then you kind of commit. The whole reason why I play D6 here is because, well, if knight F3, maybe knight F6, and if we just transpose into the main line, I would be perfectly fine with that, as there sometimes can be some tricky transpositions that I would want to avoid making a move I wouldn't normally make, like knight to c6. And the Najdorf is not as common as knight b to d7. Anyways, g6, knight to f3, and bishop to g7, all normal moves. Now we see bishop to b5, and this is where things get interesting. So I went for knight to c6. I think it's okay. I would rather go for something like knight to d7 or bishop to d7. I think bishop d7 is a lot more interesting, only because, well, we can develop our queen and develop, not our knight to e5. That'd be a very interesting first move, but just knight to c6 and just play normally. Don't go for anything crazy. Just go for a playable position. But knight c6 is really asking for trouble, and the reason why I say that is it's not necessarily the worst move or a bad move. It's just that there are some problems that can arise after bishop takes on c6 here. Where after b takes on c6, now we can see that we actually have, well, double pawns. We also have an isolated pawn, and, well, we need to play d5. But it turns out in these types of structures, this can be a problem. And the reason why it can be a problem is because, well, surprisingly, we have less control over certain central squares that we would like, especially the e5 square, where now no knight is covering e5, and, well, e5 might be playable for white. These are usually the ideas behind taking on c6, but it's just that we control and influence less of the center, surprisingly, when they take on c6. D3, I played e6, again just going for d5 as soon as possible. Castles, knight to e7, and knight to e2. You can probably guess what I played here. I played d5. I thought this was necessary because if I don't play d5 in this type of position, then I'm bound to be much worse. We see c3, bishop a6, and I'm really trying to just play c4 or something to get rid of this doubled pawn here. My opponent played e5. This is something that I was actually happy to see. The reason why I say I'm happy to see this move is because, well, now the knight has the f5 square. So normally in these positions you'd want to play f5. Of course, it's not quite working here, but these ideas are always in the position, and after like a queen e1 to h4, this is a very common idea for white in the Grand Prix. So this is e5 is something I'm very happy to see. One bad move here would be d4, for example. Of course, it does lose a pawn. That is one thing. But more importantly, even though, you know, there might be some complications with d3, but more importantly, if c4 is played, we can't really do anything about these two pawns. And maybe practically, practically, I think this may cause issues. Maybe this is objectively okay, but this isn't something you'd really willingly want to go for. You do have the b file, but this bishop on c1 is quite well placed as it is, covering the square, and white can make progress on the king side, where it's hard to make progress on the queen side because of no weaknesses here. But alright. After e5, we see castles. Bishop e3, so now the whole point is if d4 or anything, again, that it can be taken. It's also attacking the c5 square, and it's a little hard to defend. Queen to b6 looks natural, but b4 is kind of a uncomfortable move to see, unfortunately, and it looks like we're just losing the pawn, so that's not possible. Instead, I played c4. I thought this was the best attempt here. d4, I was actually expecting something, possibly even like bishop to c5, where this isn't such a big deal. I mean, it's a little scary, I guess. Maybe even knight to g3, where this pawn should be lost at some point, so it's not really that much of a concern, and getting on this diagonal looks quite scary, at least practically. Anyways, d4 was played instead, and now this bishop on e3 isn't so great, so there are some fallbacks to the move. I played queen to b6, directly targeting the b2 pawn. Maybe rook to b8 was a little bit better, followed by queen c7, rook b6, and rook b8, but we'll see this later in the game anyways. Queen to d2, rook a b8, rook a b1, and queen c7. After knight e1, which was an interesting move, I think the whole point is maybe going for g4 f5. As the position's completely closed, g4 is perfectly fine. This is similar to what you'd see in the King's Indian defense as black. Going for g-pawn pushes, that is, and going for an f push. Rook b6, knight c2, and bishop to b5. Bishop to b5 is a really silly move instead. Rook f to b8 pretty much just wins material on the spot. Queen to c1, queen to b7. This pawn is falling. Surprisingly, even a move like knight b4 actually shouldn't work. Surprisingly, due to now bishop b5 being strong, where a5 is coming. But I messed up the move order. I thought bishop b5 was necessary first, but they had to see the move knight b4 in the first place, and that's very presumptuous in this position where bishop b5 is actually just a waste of a move. My opponent played b3 instead, and I think the whole point is b3 wouldn't be allowed if I just played rook f to b8, and there would still be a huge weakness to deal with. But now they kind of get out just a little bit. Sorry, that's the one line. So bishop b5, takes, rook f b8, and again, it was a little presumptuous, and now they can play b4, which is what happened in the game. Here I spent a little bit of time. I originally was planning a5, and I'm not sure why I didn't play this. I think this is the best try and advantage, and black should actually stand slightly better here because there are no immediate breaks, and I am actually going to be getting into the position quite quickly here with a rook a6 after the pawn takes. And I think this is a very important lesson right here. In this position, I ended up playing rook a8, preparing a5, but you should always mix up the move orders. If you're trying to play a pawn break or a certain move, ask yourself, okay, so I can't play it immediately because it sacrifices something. But also, you should be asking yourself, can I play this move anyways? Like, that's how you should really think about sacrifices, because even in the previous game to this, there was an idea of taking on f6 where you had a fork against a king and a queen, where you pretty much just you lead the king into the center of the board and fork the king and the queen. So it's similar to that, just a little. It's obviously much less the stakes aren't as high for this type of tactic, but this is a very strategical tactic in that after takes and rook a6, there's a clear advantage to playing this, because, well, now we force open the queen side, and our opponent will have to play on the queen side because the king side play will be too slow, and if they're not careful, we could actually open the position a lot easier with a move like c5. But I played rook a8, and this is where the problems begin. Rook a1, rook to b7, trying to go for an a6 or a5, but it's just too slow. Rook a5, a great move. If they're trying to play a pawn break, put a piece in front of that pawn. Simplest way to avoid it. And I was just trying to improve my knight now, trying to get to the c4 square. It's really the only idea in the position. I played knight c4 here, takes, and rook b5, but trying to trade off here, it makes a little bit of sense in that we still want to go for a5, but we have to be very careful here. Knight g3, a5 of course, and f5. So I ended up taking on f5 first. I think this is okay. G takes. Here's where a blunder came in. Instead, I should have played a4. I think a4, it's a little scary, but realistically, these lines actually shouldn't be terrible for black. It should be, but even it's a bit harder to break through on either side. I was worried about an eventual e6, but why would I ever actually be scared of this? It's not actually a big deal. Just because it doesn't really do anything for the position. But this is what I should have gone for. But instead, I was seeing ghosts, and I took on f5, which is a terrible move. Terrible, terrible. I am now removing a key defender of my king, where if they were to take on g6, for example, I think another thing I was worried about is maybe e6, but e6, same thing. I just take and go queen e7. This pawn is just lost. So g takes, let's just say a random move, a4, e6 takes, queen e7. This pawn is just lost. So this also just doesn't make sense. So I'm very confused as to why I took on f5, because if I were to play a4 and they were to take like this, I think maybe h takes would be best. There is maybe some argument for g takes as well, because f1 is covered by my bishop, so I can bring my rook around. It's just that there's complications with this e pawn. So it's a protected pass pawn now, so endgames would not favor me. But okay, we're getting way too into the position. I think the whole point here is that you should really leave the tension. Don't flinch like I did here. I think that's another key lesson. But I took, and now this is just losing. Bishop h6, f4. The whole point of f4 is I'm trying to distract the queen from the d3 square so I can play bishop d3 and reroute my bishop to safety. Queen takes f4, bishop d3. So okay, my king might be a little bit safer, but also not quite. Takes on c3. I thought this was maybe the only hope because, well, this is just too embarrassing to look at. A move like queen to g5, a move like knight to f5, or well, knight to h5 is probably stronger. I thought this was just too much, so I ended up playing, after this, I ended up playing queen takes c3, and for some reason I missed the move rook to c1. So after rook c1, the best thing you can do here, other than resigning, which is definitely the best option, is to take on c1 and take the bishop. This, unfortunately, is just hopeless. My opponent is just up a rook for a queen. Takes, and I actually lose this rook now. Very, very interesting. The whole point is queen to g5, and in this position, I ended up resigning. The whole point is, if bishop to g6, there's knight to f5, and unfortunately, I'm getting back rank mated. And if I were to go king f8 or king h8, doesn't really matter, then queen to d8 picks up the rook, and in this position, yeah, after queen to g5, I just called it quits. Very unfortunate game. I would say the lesson we should take away from it is, again, don't flinch. Make sure you're playing on the right side of the board, and consider move orders. If you're looking for a pawn break, try making that pawn break in the first place, and then getting the pieces around it, because a move like a5 in this position is very, very low risk. If we go all the way back to the position, a move like a5 is very, very low risk, in the sense that this pawn is just so weak that we're going to win it back with very, very little difficulty. And that's how this position should be thought of. But unfortunately, as we saw, my opponent played quite well with their restriction. They essentially just prevented me from making my only plan, or going through with my only plan. And well, if you can't go through with one of your plans and your opponent can go through with one of theirs, they are most likely going to be better. And we saw that definitely from the game, although my blunders did not help. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and well, let's just say I shouldn't have too many losses moving forward. But I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.